Thanks very much, Adam, and thank you everyone for coming to our session this morning. I'm Naomi Godden from Edith Cowan University, and my co-presenters today are Kavita Naidu and Trimita Chakma. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that if you're based in Australia, you're based on the unceded lands of First Nations peoples across this continent. I'm based on Wadandi Budja in the southwest of WA, and my colleagues Kavita is based over in Gadigal country and Trimita is in South Korea. And I'm sure that you're all on different parts of this continent. So we'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present of these lands and pay our respects to Indigenous communities, including folks that may be on the call today. So Trimita, Kavita and I have been working together for about 5 years in the space of feminist participatory action research. And we've been working together in what we call an interesting confluence of activism and academia. We've been doing a lot of work with the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and then most recently some new projects with Plan International Australia and some other work here in Australia. So today we're going to talk about some work that we've been doing around FPAR for climate justice in Asia and the Pacific. And how we're going to do this presentation is we will begin with a few small short presentations from each of us about feminist participatory action research and how we've been doing this work in Asia and the Pacific. And then we're hoping, if the Zoom tool allows it, to host a collective discussion about feminist participatory action research and how it can be a tool for climate justice. So together with you, either through the chat or hopefully speaking in person, we'd like to be able to critically analyse the theory and practice of feminist participatory action research and some issues and challenges that can come up with FPAR in practice. So please put your comments into the chat box, and we can, we'll see if there's an opportunity to actually hear your voices as well. So I might hand over to Kavita first, who will talk about climate justice in the Asia Pacific, and she can also introduce herself to you.
Thanks, Naomi. Good morning, everyone. I'll be talking on climate justice in Asia and the Pacific. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll get straight into it. I think we're all aware now that climate change is an existential threat to humanity as a whole, and its impact are enormous and wide-ranging. And the work that we do around climate justice really looks at like the human rights impact of climate change, particularly on marginalized communities in the global south. And so, as you're aware, climate change affects a number of human rights, including social, economic, cultural, political, and environment rights. So things such as food insecurity, water insecurity, mass displacement, coastal erosion, increase in prices of food, competition over land and resources, wars, conflict, including rising authoritarianism that we see around the world, is by and large related to and intersecting with the multiple crises that climate change is unraveling across the planet as we see it today. And so the work that we focus largely on is the impact of climate change on women in the global south. And so the region that we work in is Asia and the Pacific. Now, while the impacts of climate change affects almost everybody around the world, the reality though is that disproportionate brunt of it is faced by the most marginalized communities in the global south, that being the women. So if you are able to picture in your minds the lived realities of grassroots women in this region, most of them are small-scale farmers, fisherfolk. Many are involved in informal, precarious, and unpaid work in their communities. These women, are facing increasing and epidemic levels of inequality and discrimination within their communities to begin with, because of the entrenched patriarchy in these communities. But now climate change is exacerbating and multiplying these inequalities and discrimination because of the lack of food and water, land. So it's a question about access to resources excess and ownership of having rights, and then most of all, the increasing violence against women in this region because of the colliding crises of not just the climate now, but also the pandemic. We see that women are being burdened with additional work. Women are facing greater health risks. Women are being displaced and even used in conflicts. And you can find early marriages, child trafficking, and so forth occurring across the region because of the impact of climate changes on various systems in our societies. And so the premise of the work that we're doing in climate justice is that, there is a deliberate logic, a diabolical logic behind why women have deliberately been made vulnerable in this region and why they are suffering the worst impact of climate change. And these are the systems of injustices that really the fight for climate justice is against. So we're looking at challenging our capitalist, fuel-dependent, fossil fuel-dependent economy, that is simply built on profit-making over the health of the planet and the people's lives. Colonialism, we've got a legacy of colonialism and imperialism in this region that has really forced these nations to be poor and developing because many of their natural resources, including their labor, has been exploited by the global north. A system of fundamentalism is also challenging how the women's rights and gender equality issues are being judged across the world in terms of bodily autonomy, including those who deny that even climate change exists. Militarism is rife within this region. You can see how wealth is being funneled into large military and industrial complexes over really funneling that public funding into, say, education or health services. Racism is also quite prevalent in the region. And within these systems, these are what we call the systems of injustices. And literally, these systems are a patriarchal system. It's a neoliberal, patriarchal, and racist system that prioritizes and privileges the elite and keeps wealth within the elite over women. And so climate justice, so what really is climate justice? Climate justice is really putting climate change and human rights together. So it's linking human rights and sustainable and ecological development to have a rights-based approach that safeguards the most vulnerable people on the planet so that the burdens of the climate crisis is equally and equitably shared among all responsible. So what this means actually is that there is a historical responsibility, and this is recognized in the Kyoto Protocol as well as the Paris Agreement. There is an onus that rests primarily with the global north. They bear the historical responsibility of causing climate change to begin with, through their industrial revolution and so forth. The developing countries are now facing the worst impact of economies that have developed completely from fossil fuel consumption. And so climate justice is really about developed countries bearing the responsibilities, ensuring that the work of climate justice is centered and aligned with human rights standards, that it protects indigenous rights, food security, the right to water, the right to a safe environment, and so forth. And this also applies to climate justice, looking at mitigation and adaptation. There's so much jargon, technical jargon that's used in climate justice work, but really there needs to be a safeguard and a checklist when these solutions, for instance, mitigation solutions about how emissions can be reduced, or climate solutions, there is a need to ensure that these solutions themselves are non-discriminatory and comply with human rights. In other words, to challenge market-based solutions that are simply replicating a capitalist model. So, for instance, challenging green capitalism, challenging vaccine apartheid, challenging that adaptation is actually benefiting the most marginalized communities rather than having that money actually go to a tech company for a solution that's going to cause more environment harm. So that's kind of like in a very brief nutshell, what climate justice and climate justice principles look like. And this is just an image that I absolutely love sharing when I'm talking about climate justice, that shows you the complexity and enormity of what climate justice is. Climate justice is not simply an environment, a scientific or an economic or legal problem. It is also a moral and ethical dilemma. It combines, injustices such as trade, debt, race, gender, environment. All of this is actually covered within and under and intersects with climate justice. So a lot of the work that we're doing now, it's not just about addressing the climate crisis, but the intersecting and colliding crises of the pandemic, of race, of gender inequality, of biodiversity loss. All of these are interconnected. And this just shows you, just the many arms and levers within the fabric of our society that needs to be challenged and addressed in order to achieve a gender just and ecologically sustainable planet. And so how do we do this work? So Trimita and I used to work for the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development with Naomi. This is a leading feminist organization in Asia. It's based in Asia and it covers 27 countries across Asia and the Pacific. And what APWLD does is that it fosters autonomous grassroots feminist movements across the region to challenge and influence laws, policies, and practices at the national, local, regional, and international level to promote gender equality and women's human rights. And so APWLD has a number of programs that look at gender equality and women's human rights. The program that I worked in was climate justice, and there was a manifesto that the climate justice program had developed over the years called the Feminist Fossil Fuel-Free Future, or 5Fs for short. It's basically a manifesto that discusses and analyzes an alternative degrowth development model that is not fossil fuel dependent, based on hyper extraction and hyper consumption or profit, but on a radical transformation of our existing system to one that is new, gender just, protects the rights of all individuals, primarily puts Indigenous rights and their safety and self-determination on key platforms of decision-making and policy-making around the world. And it was, this manifesto was developed in recognition of the struggles of many of our members against fighting, corporations and military and authoritarian government regimes in the region, and the vision that we wanted to have about what feminist climate justice should look like. And, this manifesto very much aligns with a number of issues that are being discussed right now, whether it's a gender just recovery to the pandemic, that's also environmentally friendly and sustainable and so forth, but a number of global Green New Deals also has the same principles. And these core principles of what this alternative system looks like, where we're literally challenging the systems of patriarchy, there's a few fundamental principles that forms this framework. Just and equitable transition, energy and resource democracy, agroecological farming practices, social wage, public financing, participatory democracy, and dismantling our current international trade and investment rules. And those of you, who are following Green New Deals and really the solutions that we're looking for to challenge our existing systems, these are the key principles and frameworks that we work around to ensure that, that the rights of the women are protected as we try and transition from a system that is bent on exploiting women's labor and natural resources for profit. And the work that we do within APWLD was framed within APWLD's own theory of change. And as you can see in the pictograph over here, which is divided into 4 parts, APWLD's theory of change works on building the capacity of the grassroots women that we work with, producing knowledge, tools, and resources, creating advocacy opportunities for grassroots women, and mobilizing, organizing, and building a feminist, autonomous feminist movements in the region. So, and we do this, making sure that we sit under a framework that promotes solidarity within feminist movements, but also promotes accountability. So accountability from, governments and political institutions on whether their demands are being met or not. So this is how the work in APWLD is being done. And the key tool that we used under the theory of change is FPAR, so Feminist Participatory Action Research. FPAR, climate justice FPAR means, how do we get grassroots women to mobilize against these systems of injustices to achieve accountability, redress, and compensation for the climate injustices that they have faced through loss and damage, discrimination, and inequality within their communities. And now I'm going to let Trimita talk more about what FPAR is. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trimita. I'm based in Seoul. I'm originally from Bangladesh. Due to the shortage of time, I'm going to jump into the content. So I'll quickly now touch base on the theory and practice of feminist participatory action research, or in short, FPAR. Can I have the next slide? Kavita. Yeah, so the theory. So FPAR is a conceptual and methodological framework that stems from PAR, which is Participatory Action Research. And so PAR aims to achieve social change through conducting research with people from oppressed groups, right? PAR also engages people involved in critical dialogue to understand systematic injustices, and also, mobilizing people as activists. So PAR fits in pretty well in terms of what we're trying to achieve through climate justice. So when you add the feminist to PAR, FPAR, it incorporates feminist theory into PAR and places attention on gender and women's lived experiences as a political choice. So that's why PAR is very useful for, a useful tool for advancing the agenda of climate justice. What is distinctive about FPAR is the way it generates knowledge, right? So it acknowledges that the process of production of knowledge, data, and expertise is influenced by hegemonic and patriarchal power. The way mainstream knowledge is produced. So FPAR specifically privileges the voices and rights of grassroots women, and seeks to transform existing structures of patriarchal power that marginalize women across their diversities, right? So, traditional power relationships between researcher and subject are also subverted with the democratic process of inquiry and action that is designed and implemented by participating women as co-researchers. So there is a deliberate shift in power that enables collective ownership of knowledge and action in the community, right? So in the traditional research, there is an existing gap between the researcher and the research. So we don't treat women as subjects of research, but through the process, through the theory of change that we have seen, we build their capacities so they can become the researcher and they become the experts of their lived experiences to generate knowledge. FPAR adopts and strengthens collective activist process, right, as with democratic and inclusive decision making. And for us, really, this methodology is really an effective way of doing activism. So we focus a lot on relationships and nurturing collective solidarity, and we use an intersectional feminist lens, honoring women's diverse experiences. I think these approaches are key to mobilizing women in a meaningful way. So you can move on to the next slide. So the theories that I just described are captured in these 9 principles of FPAR. that we follow when we do our research and activism. So you can see like the purpose of FPAR is, first, we acknowledge the purpose is structural change. It's just not about generating new knowledge. It's more than that. Also, we focus on amplifying women's voices, and we intervene in a way to make sure it's owned by the community. So it's not sitting with this one expert researcher. It takes an intersectional approach, acknowledging diverse women's experiences and multiple forms of discrimination women face based on their diversity. Of course, whenever you say feminist activism, it has to shift power. So we always check in the research process that we are doing something to shift existing power. FPAR also fosters movement building and collective action. So that's set from the onset that that the whole point of doing FPAR is to build that collective action. And FPAR builds capacity of all, not just the grassroots women, but everybody involved in the process learn something new. It also involves free, prior, continuous informed consent throughout the research process. And FPAR prioritizes safety, care, and solidarity of the women involved in the research process. So really what makes it distinctive are these 9 principles from the other ways of doing research. Moving on, this cycle, we call it, action reflection cycle. This is also really important in the process, the way we conduct research. So it involves organic cycles of action, planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. So it is a continuous cycle throughout the research process, right? So as you can see, it's not fixed. So we readjust as we move along. And we also have to acknowledge, right, when you do work with grassroots women, we have to plan around their struggles. It cannot be a fixed timeline, fixed budget. Women don't have time. They have to do so much unpaid care work. We cannot feel entitled to their time to do research. So this approach of doing action reflection cycle really helps bringing out their activism. So this is the exciting part where FPAR encourages using creative participatory data collection methods and analysis methods so that enhances inclusion and accessibility in the research process, and also builds collective ownership of the research process and findings. Especially if you're working with grassroots women, right? Many of them don't know how to read or write. So if we're only using methods that requires us to read or write, it doesn't help for to include them. But there are other ways they can tell us their stories. So if we can quickly run through some of these methods, examples of these methods. So some of these are drawing, storytelling, timelines. People can also make daily activity clock. We have participatory focus group discussions, role plays, participant interviews, mapping, and all of those. We will show you some examples of drawing. So these are women drawing their stories. So there could be some research questions, and they're answering those questions through drawing. This activity we call mandala. Moving on. Another activity is problem tree analysis. So people draw a tree to, find the root causes of the problems and, put them in a tree. Daily activity clocks are really good to look at how women spend their time. So of course, these are drawn by these migrant workers who are drawing how they spend 24 hours. So you can have different groups draw them and, compare them. It's very, and this can generate really powerful data. Especially during the COVID, this has been a really useful tool. Health, body mapping, health mapping. This is useful for drawing, mapping if you're trying to look at how climate change impacts women's health or bodies, for example, then you can ask people to draw it, and this can generate also very powerful data. Moving on to next one, this is participatory scoring and ranking. These were women in the in a stateless women living in a camp in Bangladesh. They're stranded Pakistanis So they don't have access to school, so they can't really read or write, but they can count up to 10. So we use these beads for them to rank their issues and draw to tell us about their issues. So these also can be quite creative ways of, doing participatory statistics. Moving on, social mapping, my favorite, as you can see. So this can also be very powerful tool, especially in the context of climate change. If you are working for land rights, if land is being grabbed by a mega development project, or indigenous women, reclaiming that this is their land, this is really powerful. We just bring in all of the women together to say this is our map based on their local knowledge. I don't have time to go into each of these groups. So of course, as I was emphasizing from the beginning, that the purpose of FPAR is really activism, but what happens through this creative data collection analysis methods, it generates really strong evidence. Some of them are very powerful visuals, and also it generates, can transcribe code to generate all this knowledge and then turn them into activism. And these are some examples of, you can do campaigning, petitions, convening media, press, press conference, demonstrations, and so on. Yeah. So now I would like to hand over the floor to Kavita again to talk through a couple of case studies from
Thanks, Trim. So I'll just share one or two really quickly case studies of what CJ FPAR looked like for a team of partners that we worked with quite recently. So the theme for this FPAR, which was done between 2017 and 2019, was on climate-induced displacement. We had 9 countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Vietnam participating with us for this research. I'll share with you the first example from India. So this research was done in the far northeast a part of India, in Assam, in a small village in the Sadia region. And we worked with NEEDS, which is the partner organization that's based there. So in these small villages, the climate change impact that they were facing was erratic rainfall, flooding, erosion, and unseasonal weather changes that were reducing their agricultural production. It was depleting the natural resources. And so poverty was becoming a huge problem in the region. A number of companies and investors were unfairly buying land from these poor farmers, and a number of men had then started to migrate to find work in the larger cities. Now, the impact of this on the women, many women were not able to meet their basic needs because they do not own land or resources. They ended up borrowing food from their neighbors or taking loans, therefore getting further entrenched in debt and poverty. As they were unable to pay. Women were usually left as the sole earners and carers for the children and elders in the community. So their domestic work and burden, including what they were doing in their small-scale farms, became a lot worse. They were working much longer hours. They were being exposed to greater risk of violence and harm as they had to, travel further just to collect water or find food. And given that the agricultural yields were so poor, the women would usually feed their children or the elderly than themselves. And what we found was that the nutrition among women had dropped quite alarmingly, and they were suffering from a number of health conditions as well, with no access to a healthcare facility in this part. And so what the FPAR achieved through the cycle of, working with them over the almost 3 years is that these women then decided through FPAR to mobilize, and that they needed to have a voice in their local councils and communities. So they joined the local councils called the Panchayat. And, then once they joined these local councils, they were able to raise the issues that they found that women and young girls in the community were facing. And then the local authorities were actually listening to these women. The women were being included in adaptation plans, in policy planning and development plans to ensure that women's voices were included. And The other thing, the women were also being consulted by the police for a number of investigations into crimes against women and young girls. The women were able to successfully secure funding to have a yarn bank built for them and a weaving collective so that they could have alternative sources of income to fund their livelihoods. So that was India, a very successful outcome from the FPA. In Myanmar, we worked with the Hakatanobu ethnic community from Myanmar who were displaced by Cyclone Cowan in 2015. And so Cyclone Cowan caused widespread flooding across 12 out of 14 states, followed by a massive landslide. And so up to 55,000 people were affected and more than 20,000 were displaced. So the community that we worked with here were a resettled community. They were resettled from their hill tribes to a sort of just a small suburb right outside one of the larger cities. So what they found is that their resettled community lacked basic infrastructure and services, such as proper housing, roads, water, waste management, schools, medical access, and there was no regular source of income because most of the hill tribes or of this ethnic community were farmers. So they had to find alternative work. But the alternative work was only available to men who could travel into the cities and work as apprentices and so forth. For women, now, this was an ethnic community and very conservative Christian community. So women were not given an equal voice or having rights, and they were mainly excluded from any decision-making processes, from owning land or even participating in any community meetings and so forth. And so the Hakatanobu women were mainly uneducated, but they were very skilled in agriculture. But in the resettled community, they did not have land in which they could farm. So they were forced to also find other means of work, such as, domestic care in the larger city and so forth. Without access to, again, medical facilities, you can see that there are common challenges in a number of these communities across the region. The women, again, suffered the most as they could not access, proper sexual and reproductive health clinics. They lacked immunizations, the infant mortality rates increased, and the women were forced to, use materials to burn. One, because the waste had become so enormous in the community and they were, inhaling and getting exposed to toxic air pollution just by burning rubbish because there was no other way to get rid of rubbish. And so what these women then did through FPA is more than 400 of them mobilized and formed their own community-based organization. They then decided to, do a number of campaigns where they shared the report that they wrote about what the climate change impacts in the resettled community has been like for the women and the discrimination and inequality that they've been facing. They managed to go and meet with the Minister of Parliament, proposing what they think that they sought for their demands. And they were able to secure funding to actually build an office so that they're able to continue doing their work. They went to the media and shared their findings with the media. They're sitting with other local authorities in planning policies, adaptation policies to ensure that, the human rights and the living conditions of the women in the community are being improved. So these are two very quick examples of what FPA was able to achieve in these two countries. And now I'm going to turn this back to Naomi to share with us the findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. So through the process of the CJ FPA program, I was very fortunate to be involved with APWD and Kavita and Trimita to facilitate or sort of lead a participatory evaluation of the CJ FPA program. And this evaluation was part funded by APWLD, but also with some financial contributions from the Research for Development Impact Network and from Oxfam Australia. And I think that these groups particularly wanted to help undergo this evaluation so that we could have a better understanding as a movement here in Australia about the impact and effectiveness of FPA as a methodology for social change and gender equality. Now, the evaluation methodology for this was very much co-designed with the women's groups who are involved in the CJFPAR program. So we had baseline and endline interviews that were conducted at the beginning and at the end of the CJFPAR program. Also document analysis of the reports that the different teams had produced. And then we had a 2-day final evaluation workshop, which was a participatory workshop with a range of really interesting and quite fun participatory and arts-based methods, where we were able to collectively reflect on and identify the impacts of the CJFPAR program. Now, we've actually published an article documenting the findings of this evaluation. So this, on the slide here, you can see that reference. And this article is actually available freely from the Oxfam Gender and Development journal. You can get it through the Oxfam repository. So I'll put the link up later onto the chat for that, but it's worth having a read because it gives a really great overview of not only the CJFPAR program, but also what the impacts are in communities. So thank you, Kav. We'll go on to the first area of impact. So as we discussed earlier, the way that APWD conducts its CJ or its FPAR programming is across its theory of change. And so that's how we evaluated the impacts of the program. And the first chunk of analysis was around capacity building and how the program has actually built the capacity of women and movements within the region. So what we found through the evaluation was that before the CJFPAR program, women had generally fairly limited technical knowledge about climate change, climate justice and development justice. And this was women participating in the program as the young women researchers and their mentors, and also in their communities. But they did have extensive traditional knowledge in their communities about adapting to climate change, but they didn't necessarily identify it in that particular way. So through the CJFPAR program, we have identified that over 1,000 grassroots women across all the 9 countries gain knowledge on their human rights, the climate crisis, environmental and climate justice, patriarchy, and development justice. And this occurred through women engaging in a whole range of different consciousness raising processes through the FPAR programs, whether it was discussions, dialogues, the participatory methods of FPAR, workshops and training, and so on. So women really were able to increase their knowledge about understanding climate change and how climate change is an issue of gender inequality. Women also gained a huge amount of knowledge and skills around leadership and participating in social change processes. So this was, gaining skills in advocacy and campaigning and public speaking, and of course, doing participatory research. And this is really powerful, of course, because women, can take these skills and use them further in the future beyond the program itself in terms of being part of the processes of social change. So definitely the evaluation found that participants and women involved in the CJFPAR program understand global warming, understand how it relates to systems of injustice and systems of power, and also have an understanding of community politics and climate change policies, and understanding about how they can be part of a systematic process of challenging those particular structures. So moving on to the second part of the theory of change was around knowledge, tools and resources. So when we conducted the evaluation, we found that CJFPAR supported women to document their lived experiences of climate injustice and then to use that to inform their advocacy. So teams and women in communities used a whole range of FPAR methods like focus group discussions, interviews, workshops, social mapping and storytelling, and so on. They also learned how to use a range of activism and community organising strategies like power mapping, theory of change, and critical pathway. And they were able to use those to then produce reports and publications that document their lived experiences of climate change and gendered injustices, and also creative tools and ways of communicating these issues around the community. So we saw a whole range of really interesting tools like street theatre, storytelling, posters, paintings, and so forth being produced by women to increase consciousness in their communities about their issues and to demand climate and gender justice for them. The third area is around advocacy. So, thanks, Kev. So prior to CJFPAR, some of the organisations that were participating in the program were involved in some levels of advocacy, but often at a very local level, and it wasn't particularly organised or systemised. Through CJFPAR, and particularly through creating a critical pathway and a theory of change, women who participated were very much now have increased involvement in climate justice decision-making in their communities and at regional and national levels, and have increased participation in climate-related meetings. So there's now hundreds of women who are actively involved in these decision-making processes through participating through the CJFPAR program. Women are engaging in advocacy with local community leaders, local government, with members of parliament and with ministers, taking the knowledge that they have generated in their communities as an evidence base to then demand their human rights at all levels of government. And they're using a whole range now of different tools and strategies for advocacy, campaigning, monitoring, lobbying, letter writing, petitioning, and so on. And I'll talk about some of the great outcomes in a second for where that advocacy has arrived at. The fourth area, thanks Kavita, is around movement architecture. So what the CJFPAR really does is it strengthens how movements coordinate and how they work together, as well as strengthening their own capacities and their power. And certainly a really exciting outcome of the CJFPAR program is that across the 9 countries who participated, we now have 50 new feminist groups, networks and alliances for climate justice. And these are groups like forest user women's groups or women's weaving groups, some regional feminist networks, particularly in places that have never had women coordinating and collaborating previously. We've also seen women undertake some quite brave and innovative frontline action, like women in Pakistan, for example, undertaking a global strike for women and doing direct action for fossil fuel extraction companies in their communities. We now have new women-led government advisory groups in some of these countries. For example, in Nepal, a new natural resource management committee has been set up in these particular communities, led by women with a direct advisory voice to government. Thanks, Kavita. So we have some really exciting, notable outcomes of CJFPAR. In Pakistan, the women who participated in the program, this was, you know, some of the first sort of mobilising work that they had done, and knowing the context of Pakistan, it was extremely brave work that they were doing. Government officials in Pakistan, through the work of CJFPAR, have now committed to holding local industries accountable to act more responsibly in reducing emissions and curbing pollution. Now, the women worked really hard to have a meeting with their minister. We were denied the meeting several times. Finally, we were able to meet with him, and then we're able to actually quite strongly influence how his understanding of climate change, of fossil fuel extraction and the impacts on women. So this is a really exciting outcome for that community. In Nepal, we saw local governments allocate budgets for environmental projects that were led by women. We've also seen women being actively involved in climate-related policy development in areas like agricultural adaptation and disaster management, and working in partnership with governments to reform processes and policies to ensure that women's human rights are upheld in the context of climate change. There are, of course, some challenges with this program, and I think this is really important for us, you know, to always reflect on. So one of the hardest things about women engaging in FPAR processes is that we have a huge workload already with our domestic responsibilities, paid and unpaid labour, and there's limited time to participate in climate justice activism. So engaging in an FPAR process is particularly challenging. Of course, women are experiencing in their lives every day patriarchal attitudes and policies and practices. And women in our program really face a lot of resistance, either initially or throughout the CJFPAR process, in trying to do their work, to mobilise and to challenge, be engaging in advocacy. So sometimes government officials were refusing to talk to women, hindering access to information and so on. And this third part, I think, is probably the most profound and the most challenging, is the fact that there is really, for women engaging in activism, particularly climate activism, that's challenging corporate and corporate fossil fuel extraction and lots of big powers, is that women are at significant risk of harassment, of government intervention, of arrests and honour killings. And these are a real threat across the Asia-Pacific region. Some men in communities were expressing their concerns about being overpowered by women. And so, you know, women engaging in the program are navigating already the patriarchal structures within their communities to participate in FPAR and to try and, you know, stand up for their rights around climate justice. And further, then the systems of power are actually making it even more difficult by deliberately silencing their voices. So there's lots of ethical questions that come out for us when we think about undertaking FPAR, and this is, I think, a really important thing for us all to think about if you're, you know, interested in FPAR in the future. So look, that's a quick flyby discussion about how we undertook the FPAR program and some of the interesting findings that came about. What we want to do now is open up to talk about really sort of include you in the discussion now about FPAR and what potential you can see for FPAR for climate justice in your local communities, regionally, nationally and internationally. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually pose some questions back out to you as the listeners and audience in this discussion. And if you'd like to respond or you have something you'd like to say, you can put your hand up. We'll allow you to then speak. And the intention here is to try and foster, in the webinar context, a bit of a collective discussion and dialogue about FPAR, because certainly, you know, we're all learning and there are a lot of challenges and possibilities of FPAR. So we definitely want to open up that discussion. So I'm going to turn over to Trim to ask the first question, and please put your hand up or contribute to the Q&A if you have something you'd like to say.
Yeah, we do have a few questions in the Q&A. We should respond in a bit. So I have argued in my in my presentation that FPAR is a methodology for activism, methodology of activism for structural change. So I want to know from you, what does action for structural change to achieve climate justice look like in small scale FPAR projects? Are you aware of any actions, for structural change?
If you have a response, please click on the raise hand option.
Now, Adam, I can't see all the respondents, so I think you'll have to tell us if there's people who put their hand up.
Or nobody's putting a hand up. We have some interesting questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, maybe let's start with the Q&A.
Yeah, let's just answer some of the Q&A.
Okay, maybe we can go to that first question around between men's and women's groups, who has more impact on gender change and why? Trimita, I wonder if you would like to start by responding to that.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, Kavita explained a whole lot on why women are disproportionately impacted by climate change, right? But if I give you some very practical examples, one would be, you know, in the earthquake in Nepal that happened a few years ago. In some villages, you know, all of the people who died were women or children. So we must ask the question, how come? How come all that it were just women and children, right? So if you look deeper, you'll see it's because they were staying at home, and, you know, in the earthquake, the home collapsed and they died because in the cultural norm and according to the gender roles assigned, men work outside home, right, during the day, and women stay home. So that is the prescription, and that's why they are more vulnerable. In Vietnam, we work with the community. Women were not historically ever part of any disaster response teams. So we did an FPAR actually to include them. Yes, 2015, thank you. I was thinking 15 or 17. And the other example is in many cultures, because women are supposed to stay at home, they also don't learn to swim, right? So when you have flood or tsunami, women cannot swim. But boys are allowed to swim. So some of these gender roles and patriarchal norms impact, contribute to women's vulnerability to climate change.
Thanks, Trimita. We'll go on to the second question, which is about whether we're working in the Pacific Island region. Kav, would you like to respond to that? You can talk a bit about our plan project.
Thanks. So I'm from Fiji originally, and right now the same team, Naomi, Trim and I, we're working with Plan International Australia, and we're doing FPAR in Fiji and Kiribati. And we hope that's the first of many FPARs to come in the region.
And this FPAR project is working with young women and girls to understand the impacts of climate change on girls in their lives, but also working with girls to identify the actions that they would like to see happen to address these issues, and how girls can be engaging in activism to demand their human rights. So COVID's been extremely challenging to support this project, of course. We're training young women researchers in Kiribati and Fiji via Zoom, so they can go and undertake the research in their communities with girls. So we work, do a lot of online discussion with them, which can be difficult with, of course, internet challenges. But this, I think, we'll be releasing a report for this around the end of the year. So do keep your eyes open for this one, because I think it's, again, providing some really interesting insight into climate change, but also into FPAR.
Can I add to that? So we also worked with a group of women in Papua New Guinea back in 2013, I think. So I'll share the report in the chat. So it was a group of a community living in the Carteret Islands that drowned because of the sea level rise, and they were relocated in a camp. And then the women were organizing for, and advocating for an early warning system and so on. I will put the report in the chat so you can look. I'm conscious of time.
Thanks, Trim. There's another question here of, do we find there are challenges and opportunities working intergenerationally between younger and older women? Kav or Trim, would either of you like to start that one off?
Yeah, there are challenges in terms of, one language. We find that the younger generation, is more fluent with English. The younger generation is more digitally and technologically savvy. And so, we really have to identify what are the means to make sure that we are very inclusive in the FPAR trainings that we do, to ensure that there is an even balance, between the young women, but also those of a different generation, because, they're the ones that bring in the knowledge and the lived experiences of going through different climatic changes, the levels of discrimination and inequality in the community. So they've actually seen from history to what was to what is now. And so these are the opportunities that we work with, because the younger generation women are able to get the older generation women on board with understanding some of these more new tools that we use for training and understanding knowledge. We use the younger women to also help us translate and interpret a lot of this information. And then the younger women themselves learn so much more from the older women because of their knowledge and experience of their lived realities.
I can add to that as well. The way that APWLD does FPAR, and certainly we've continued that with other projects that we're doing, is that we generally engage young women researchers in leading the processes in their communities, but they also are connected with mentors, usually older women, feminist women with a lot more experience in activism and feminist work in their communities. And so there's a really beautiful knowledge transfer that's happening, and mentoring and support of young women to develop their capacities and skills as leaders for climate justice in their communities. And what we do find, though, is that it's not just a knowledge transfer one way, because the mentors and the young women researchers are learning together, and they are developing each other's knowledge and sharing together. So the intergenerational interaction actually really strengthens the program. we'll open up to another question. Syra has asked, can we give some more examples about advocacy tools? Trim, you're good at this.
Yeah, actually, I typed the answer. So I hope you can see it. We use participatory methods to, you saw the problem tree analysis to analyze the problems in the community first. And then we use the participatory ranking and scoring to cut down the issue to set one campaign goal. And we use power mapping to analyze the power, different actors that have power to make the change. And there's another tool called Critical Pathway, which helps us to set milestones for campaign goals and advocacy actions and so on. It sounds very technical, but I think we do have, read our article, there is more details in there. And I just shared the report on the PNG, including the PNG from 2015.
Thanks, Trim. There's a question here from Francis, and I'll read it out. Is there a danger with the methodology of conflating gender and other aspects of inequality, like class and ethnicity? And does this marginalise men when they could be more involved in issues like climate justice? Kav, would you like to start this one off?
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. So the feminist climate justice is about challenging patriarchy and really recognizing that the systems of injustices are driven mainly by men, and they're white elite men, rich men in the global north. But also within this region, patriarchy is driven by males. So it's not a question about really marginalizing men, but understanding the systems of injustices that have allowed for these power dynamics and stereotype roles between men and women. And so so what we try to do is to address how that is now multiplying and exacerbating existing inequalities through the lens of climate change. And so there is a need. Climate justice really is about looking at inequality, discrimination, and human rights violations without being selective. It's really a wholesome analysis of the injustices and inequality. So it's really not about separating men and women. It's about challenging the systems that have put in play the gendered imbalances and the gendered impacts of climate change. And so within the movement, and remember, FPAR is not just about women working for the women in the community, it's actually about the whole community. These women are leading and making sure that they're politically active and having the space to address the issues for the whole community, not just for the women. And I can see we're about 1 minute away from time.
Trim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so because Adam is telling us we'll wrap up soon, but we have a little bit more than a minute. I just wanted to say I work for a global trade union federation called Public Services International, and we engage with trade unionists, so working class people, which includes men, and men have been very active in that movement in ensuring just an equitable transition away from fossil fuel to renewable energy. So yes, of course, class matters. It's going to impact the people in the lower strata. I hate that word, but more. And also when we move away from fossil fuel, it's going to affect the workers. So there is a lot of space for men to engage, to challenge the system as well. I don't think the movement or working on gender marginalizes men. It's just, we have to work together. It's the same fight, it's the same challenge, and it's coming after everyone. So I wouldn't put too much focus on marginalization of men, but acknowledge the realities and see what we can do. Yeah. If you want to know more about that, yeah, get in touch on how to use unions and unionizing to moving to a just and equitable transition to renewable energies. Yeah.
And I think it's important to return back to how this work with FPAR very much is grounded in understanding that injustice is caused by multiple systems of fundamentalism, of globalization, of militarism, patriarchy, capitalism, of course. And so the approach really tries to bring those together to support women as activists to understand how those different systems affect their lives and the lives of their communities, and bring about the injustices that we're experiencing globally and locally, and then use that to inform activism to try and challenge those structures. And you know, certainly APWLD's 5 Fs, the feminist fossil fuel, oh gosh, what is it, Cav? Feminist fossil fuel free future manifesto, it covers the whole range of those different systems that come together to bring about inequality. So I think that when we return back to this structural analysis, that's very helpful for us to understand that FPAR is certainly moves beyond gender. It's understanding gender and its interaction with a whole range of different injustices. Okay, I think we're going to finish up there. So thank you everyone so much for attending and participating. We've really enjoyed sharing this experience with you. Please read the article if you'd like to learn more about the program, and do be in touch with us. We're always really happy to chat to people about the experiences and to share more about climate change, climate justice and FPAR. So with that, there's our details there if you'd like to jot down our email addresses. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.